people who've had nightmare neighbors. How bad did it get? I lived next to a guy who fancied himself a gourmet chef, but he had the success rate of a toddler trying to make a souffle. Every night, he'd attempt some incredibly complex dish, and without fail, something would go horribly wrong. Instead of just throwing his burnt, smoking, or gelatinous failures into the trash like a normal person, he decided his backyard was a compost pile for his culinary experiments. This wasn't composting, it was a biohazard. Piles of uncooked fish heads, failed sourdough starters that bubbled like lava, and entire trays of scorched casseroles just sat there rotting. Soon, our neighborhood became the go-to spot for every raccoon, stray cat, and flock of seagulls within a 10-mile radius. It got so bad that animal control had to intervene, telling him his compost pile had created a brand new and very aggressive ecosystem. When a woman with dozens of wind chimes and a coexist bumper sticker moved in next door, I thought, great, a peaceful hippie. She introduced herself as a pet psychic who could communicate with animals on a spiritual level. A few weeks later, people's cats started vanishing. Mrs. Davis from down the street was heartbroken over her missing fluffy Persian. The next day, a flyer from my neighbor appeared on the community notice board. Is your beloved pet missing? For a small fee, I can channel their energy and guide them home. She was charging people $100 for a psychic reading, and miraculously, their cats would reappear in her backyard a day later. This went on for months until someone caught her on camera luring a cat into her house with a can of tuna. She wasn't a psychic, she was just running a catnapping racket. My upstairs neighbors, a sweet-looking elderly couple, asked me one day if I minded a little noise in the mornings. I said of course not, thinking they meant a loud TV or maybe some creaky floorboards. The next morning at precisely 5 a.m., my entire apartment began to violently shake. It sounded like a stampede of horses was happening right above my head. It was rhythmic, aggressive, and relentless. I went up to ask what on earth was going on, and the husband opened the door, drenched in sweat, wearing tap shoes. He cheerfully explained that he and his wife had taken up Irish River dancing to stay active in their golden years. They had ripped up their carpet to install a custom hardwood dance floor and practiced for 2 hours every single morning. I had to live through that thunderous nightmare for a year before their lease was finally up. I once lived in an apartment building where the walls were paper thin. My neighbor across the hall was a guy in his late 20s who clearly missed his glory days as a high school athlete. One night, I heard a loud thump, thump, thump followed by a metallic rattling sound against my door. I looked through the peephole and saw him, in a full Michael Jordan jersey, shooting hoops. He had installed a miniature basketball hoop on the back of his own apartment door and was practicing his free throws in the narrow hallway. The thump was the ball hitting the door, and the rattle was the cheap rim. He did this at all hours, sometimes at 2 a.m. The building manager had to send out a memo specifically stating, hallways are not to be used for sporting activities of any kind. My neighbor was a conspiracy theorist, but his obsession wasn't with the government or aliens. It was with my Wi-Fi. He was utterly convinced that my internet signal was a form of electromagnetic mind control, specifically targeting him. The first sign something was wrong was when he covered every single window of his house with tinfoil, turning it into a giant baked potato. Then came the confrontations. He'd wait for me to leave for work and shout things like, "Stop beaming your thoughts into my dog," or "I know you're controlling my toaster." The final straw was when I found him in my yard at midnight, wearing a tinfoil hat and performing some kind of ritual to cleanse the airwaves. I switched my Wi-Fi name to FBI Surveillance Van Number 3, and he moved out a month later. The family next door seemed normal enough, until I noticed a different set of parents picking up kids from their house every single day. It turned out they were running an illegal, unlicensed daycare with about 15 toddlers in a 2-bedroom house. The problem was, they weren't very good at watching them. At least twice a week, a kid would manage to escape. I'd be in my living room and suddenly see a 3-year-old streaking through my backyard or trying to climb my fence. One time, I found a little girl trying to ride my very large and very confused golden retriever. It was absolute chaos. I called Child Protective Services after I saw a toddler on their roof. The daycare was shut down immediately, and I thankfully got my quiet, kid-free yard back. I moved into a beautiful apartment complex with a serene, shared courtyard. It was peaceful for exactly one day. On my second morning, I was jolted awake by the most ungodly sound I have ever heard. It was like a goose being strangled while a fire alarm went off. I looked out my window and saw my neighbor, a man in his 60s wearing a full kilt, playing the bagpipes. He was standing in the center of the courtyard at sunrise. When a few of us went to complain, he explained with a straight face that he was honoring his Scottish ancestors and that playing the pipes at dawn was a sacred ritual. He refused to stop, claiming it was his religious freedom. The landlord eventually found a loophole in the lease under the excessive noise clause, and my mornings returned to normal. My neighbor was a thief, but a very strange and specific one. He didn't steal packages or mail. Instead, he stole one random, decorative item from our porch every single week. It started with a small potted plant. The next week, one of my welcome mats vanished. Then, my left rain boot disappeared from the pair I'd left outside to dry. I thought I was going crazy until I happened to glance into his living room window one evening. There, on a series of shelves, was a museum of our stolen porch items. My boot, the mat, the plant, even a single garden gnome he'd swiped. He wasn't selling them, he was collecting them like trophies. We called the police, and they made him return every last bizarre item. He never made eye contact with us again. My downstairs neighbor decided to get into the hobby of homebrewing beer. At first, it just meant the hallway constantly smelled like yeast and hops, which I could live with. But he clearly didn't know what he was doing. One night, I was watching a movie when a massive boom shook my entire apartment. It sounded like a bomb had gone off. I ran downstairs to find the hallway filled with smoke, the smell of stale beer. A bottle had exploded in his apartment with enough force to blow a hole in his door. This became a regular occurrence. About once a month, I'd hear a terrifying explosion from below. The landlord finally evicted him after one of his beer bombs shattered a window and sent glass flying into the parking lot. A woman in my building was completely convinced she was a secret agent working for a mysterious, unnamed agency. She'd wear dark sunglasses at night and discreetly talk into her sleeve while walking down the hallway. Her main mission seemed to be surveilling the rest of us. I'd catch her peering at me from behind a newspaper with eye holes cut out of it. The worst part was her preferred vantage point, the roof. She would climb the fire escape to monitor enemy movements. More than once, the fire department had to be called because she'd lose her footing and end up dangling from the gutter or falling into someone's prize-winning rose bushes. She moved out after the landlord threatened to charge her for the constant emergency service calls. My neighbor got really into the urban homesteading trend. He built a chicken coop in his tiny backyard, which was fine until he decided his flock needed a leader. He bought a rooster. If you've never lived next to a rooster, let me tell you, they don't just crow at sunrise. This thing had no concept of time. It would crow at 3 a.m., at midnight, during a thunderstorm, any time it felt like it. It was so loud it would shake my windows. I called animal control, the police, the city, but they all said the same thing. As long as he's not violating any specific city ordinance, there's nothing we can do. After 3 months of sleep deprivation, a petition signed by the entire neighborhood finally convinced the city to reclassify roosters as a public nuisance. The guy who lived next door to my parents was a hoarder, but he had a very specific obsession: old tires. His yard, once a nice patch of grass, slowly transformed into a mountain of rubber. He had truck tires, bicycle tires, tractor tires, you name it. The problem was, the tires collected rainwater, and his entire property became a stagnant swamp. It was the perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. You couldn't even step outside in the summer without being swarmed by a cloud of them. The city issued him warning after warning, but he refused to clean it up. It got so bad that the health department had to declare his property a public health hazard and send in a crew with a crane to remove literally tons of rotting, water-filled tires. The couple across the street had the most toxic, explosive fights I have ever witnessed, but they never yelled. Instead, they had a bizarre, silent method of arguing. After a disagreement, one of them would go inside and write a scathing insult on a giant piece of poster board. They would then stand in their front window, holding up the sign for the other to see. I saw signs that said things like, "You have the credit score of a squirrel and your lasagna tastes like defeat." It was a daily soap opera for the whole neighborhood. Their fights would go on for hours, with them just silently holding up increasingly personal and vicious signs. It was deeply weird, and honestly, way more disturbing than if they had just screamed at each other. My neighbor's teenage son decided he wanted to be a rock star. He formed a band with his friends, and they practiced in the garage right next to my house. I was prepared for loud, terrible music. What I wasn't prepared for was their playlist. They only knew how to play one song, a sloppy, out-of-tune cover of Smoke on the Water, and they would play it over and over again for hours. Every Saturday, from noon until dinner, my house would vibrate to the same agonizing riff. I heard that song so many times I started having nightmares about it. I once timed them playing it 37 consecutive times without a break. They never learned another song. I have never been so happy to see a family move. My neighbor was obsessed with his lawn. He had the greenest, most perfectly manicured grass you've ever seen. He would spend his weekends with a ruler and scissors, making sure every blade was the exact same height. He mowed it in perfect, military straight diagonal lines. The problem was, his obsession extended to our property. If a single one of our dandelions dared to sprout near his property line, he'd treat it like an act of war. One morning, I woke up to find he had mowed a single, angry-looking strip right through the middle of our flower bed. He claimed one of our rose bushes was casting an unsightly shadow on his lawn. We had to install a fence just to protect our yard from his reign of landscaping terror. I had a neighbor who ran the strangest little scam I've ever encountered. Every week on trash day, he would wait for the garbage truck to come and empty all the bins on our street. As soon as the truck was gone, he would sneak out and steal our empty trash cans. He'd just roll them down the street and hide them behind his house. The next day, he'd knock on our door and say, "Hey, I noticed your trash can is missing. I happen to have a spare one I can sell you for $20. He was literally stealing our own property and then trying to sell it back to us. This went on for a month before we caught him on a security camera dragging 3 of our neighbors' cans into his garage. I rented an apartment that seemed perfect, except for one small detail the landlord forgot to mention. The unit next door was the designated rehearsal space for a professional clown troupe. 3 times a week, my apartment would be filled with the sounds of chaos. I'd hear upbeat circus music, the incessant squeak 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 of clown noses, and the thud of people practicing pratfalls against our shared wall. The worst was when they practiced their unicycle routine. My floor would vibrate for hours. One time, I opened my door to find a man in full clown makeup and a tiny hat trying to juggle flaming torches in the hallway. I broke my lease the next day. There are some things you just can't live with, and a neighboring clown college is one of them. A woman in my building had 12 small, yappy dogs in a studio apartment. The smell was bad enough, but her laziness made it a living hell. She refused to take them outside for walks. Instead, she would just open her apartment door and let them use the entire hallway as their personal bathroom. The carpet was completely ruined. You had to play a real-life game of Minesweeper just to get to the elevator. When residents complained, she would deny it was her dogs, claiming the smell was from a sewer gas leak that only she was sensitive to. The building manager finally used security footage to prove it was her tiny army of dogs and evicted her. The entire hallway carpet had to be ripped out and replaced. My neighbor was a UFO enthusiast, which was fine until his paranoia started affecting my sleep schedule. He became convinced that aliens were planning to abduct him from his home. To protect himself, he went to a hardware store and bought the most powerful industrial-grade spotlight I have ever seen. It was the kind of light they used to illuminate sports stadiums. He mounted it on a pole in his backyard and aimed it directly at my bedroom window because my house was in the direct flight path of their mothership. It was like trying to sleep on the surface of the sun. It lit up my entire house all night, every night. I had to buy blackout curtains so thick they felt like they were made of lead. The guy who lived above me was a competitive bodybuilder. I knew this because he would grunt so loudly during his workouts it sounded like he was fighting a bear. The real problem, however, was the weights. He had a full set of free weights in his living room, right above my bedroom. Every night after his workout, he would just drop them. Not place them down, but drop them from waist height. A 200-pound barbell hitting the floor above you sounded like a car crashing through your ceiling. It would knock picture frames off my walls and make my light fixtures swing violently. I complained to him, and he just said, "Sorry bro, gains over pains." He only stopped after he dropped a dumbbell so hard it actually cracked my ceiling. The family next door must have owned a butcher shop because they had a massive barbecue every single night of the week, rain or shine. And their grill was positioned so that all the smoke blew directly into my open windows. It wasn't a pleasant, smoky aroma. It was a thick, greasy cloud of burning fat that clung to everything. My clothes, my furniture, my hair, everything constantly smelled like I had been working the grill at a cheap diner. It was impossible to get fresh air in the summer. I tried talking to them, but they just offered me a charred burger and told me to lighten up. I eventually had to file a nuisance complaint with the city when my smoke alarm started going off from their secondhand cooking fumes. I had the misfortune of living next to a wannabe YouTube star whose entire channel was dedicated to epic public pranks. His idea of comedy was staging fake, disruptive emergencies. I'd be woken up at 3 a.m. by him screaming for help, only to see him filming his neighbor's panicked reactions from his balcony. He would pull the fire alarm in our building just to record the evacuation. His magnum opus was when he used a smoke machine to fill the hallway with thick fog and then ran up and down yelling about a chemical spill. He was finally evicted after his fake home invasion prank resulted in 3 police cars and a SWAT team showing up. His YouTube channel never even broke 1,000 subscribers. My neighbor was the president of our ridiculously strict homeowners association. He was a stickler for every tiny rule. The year we moved in, we got an official violation notice because our Christmas lights were one shade too bright and created an ambience of visual aggression. The next year, we decided to put up no lights at all to avoid another fine. He, on the other hand, transformed his house into a full-blown Christmas apocalypse. He had an inflatable Santa the size of a bus, a sound system blasting carols 24/7, and a light display so bright that it probably disrupted local air traffic. When we pointed out the hypocrisy, he just said, "As HOA president, I have to test the limits of the regulations." The woman who lived in the apartment below me was convinced I was the loudest person on the planet. She would complain if I walked from my living room to my kitchen, claiming my heavy footsteps were causing her emotional distress. I started tiptoeing around my own apartment, but it wasn't enough. She decided to take matters into her own hands. Anytime I made the slightest noise, flushing the toilet, closing a cabinet, even sneezing, she would start violently banging on her ceiling with a broomstick. It was like living above a constant, angry drum solo. It got so bad that the neighbor below her started complaining about the noise she was making by hitting the ceiling. It was a whole chain of noise complaints. My neighbor decided that his suburban driveway was the ideal location to start a career as a freelance car mechanic. It started with one old, rusty pickup truck. Soon, there were half a dozen junk heaps in various states of disassembly lining our street. His entire driveway was covered in a permanent, rainbow-colored oil slick. He would be out there at all hours, grinding metal, revving engines, and using power tools that sounded like dental drills from hell. Our street, once a quiet cul-de-sac, looked like a post-apocalyptic junkyard. The city finally towed all the unregistered vehicles after one of them started leaking gasoline all over the road, creating a massive fire hazard. He never tried to fix a car again.